In the pantheon of American gangsters, there are men who ruled with fear, men who ruled with money, and then there was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, who ruled with an intellect so sharp it could cut through the steel of a prison cell. By the mid-1950s, Harlem was not just a neighborhood in New York City, it was a sovereign state, and Bumpy was its absolute monarch. To walk down Lenox Avenue in those days was to walk through a kingdom where the police, the politicians, and the judges all bowed to the same unseen authority. Bumpy had survived the brutal, bloody wars with Dutch Schultz. He had stared down the most ruthless killers of the Italian Cosa Nostra and forced them to treat him as an equal partner. He was the Robin Hood of the ghetto, a man who handed out turkeys on Thanksgiving and paid for the tuitions of fatherless children, cultivating a reputation that was part savior and part warlord. But the foundation of Bumpy Johnson's power wasn't just his ability to command violence, it was his ability to command respect. And the cornerstone of that respect was his home life. To the public, and most importantly to the people of Harlem, Bumpy's marriage to Mame Johnson was the sacred ground upon which his legitimacy stood. Mame was not merely a gangster's wife. She was a queen in her own right. She was a woman of impeccable grace, sharp wit, and a steel spine. The kind of woman who could host a dinner party for the city's elite while knowing exactly where the pistol was taped beneath the table. She was the gatekeeper of Bumpy's legacy, the one who ensured that the dirt of the numbers racket never stained the polished mahogany floors of their apartment in Lenox Terrace. Their partnership was viewed as the gold standard of black dignity in an era of crushing segregation. Bumpy knew that his power on the street depended heavily on his image as a man of honor, a man who protected his own. But every man, no matter how disciplined, has a shadow. And in 1954, Bumpy's shadow took the form of a woman named Helen. Helen was an anomaly in Bumpy's world. She did not belong to the streets, nor did she belong to the quiet, dignified social circles of Harlem's black elite. She was a creature of Midtown Manhattan, a high society white reporter with a press pass tucked into her purse, and a burning ambition to write the story that would define her career. She had come uptown with the intention of exposing Bumpy Johnson. She wanted to peel back the layers of the Robin Hood myth and reveal the criminal machinery beneath. She expected to find a thug, a brute who spoke in the broken language of violence. Instead, when she finally secured a meeting with him in the back room of a dim, smoke-filled jazz club on 125th Street, she found a man who was reading Machiavelli. She found a man who could debate the intricacies of constitutional law and quote Shakespeare's tragedies from memory. The chemistry between them was immediate, volatile, and profoundly dangerous. For Bumpy, Helen represented the one thing he could never conquer, the intellectual freedom of the white establishment. She challenged him not with a gun, but with ideas. She asked him questions that no one in his inner circle dared to ask, probing the morality of his empire and the contradictions of his life. For Helen, Bumpy was a revelation. He was raw power, refined into a terrifying elegance. He was a man who lived by a code that the hypocritical society downtown could never understand. What began as an interview quickly dissolved into a series of clandestine meetings that had nothing to do with journalism. They met in the shadows, in the spaces between worlds. Bumpy secured a private apartment on the fringes of the Upper West Side, a pre-war building with a doorman who knew the value of $100 bill and a closed mouth. It was a neutral ground, a bubble suspended in time where the racial laws of the 1950s America could be temporarily ignored. Inside that apartment, Bumpy wasn't the godfather. He was just a man. And Helen wasn't a reporter. She was just a woman. But outside those walls, their connection was a nuclear bomb waiting to detonate. In 1954, an interracial affair involving a high-profile black crime boss and a white society woman was not just a scandal, it was a death sentence. If the press got wind of it, Helen's life would be ruined, her career incinerated. If the streets found out, Bumpy's carefully cultivated image of black pride and strength would be shattered. But the true danger lay with the Italians. The Genovese family, with whom Bumpy had an uneasy truce, was always looking for leverage. They were always hunting for a crack in the armor. If they discovered that Bumpy Johnson had a white mistress, they wouldn't just use it to shame him, they would use it to destroy him. They would see it as a weakness, a distraction, a betrayal of his own people that could be exploited to incite a rebellion within his own ranks. Bumpy knew the risks. He was a strategist who calculated every move 5 steps ahead. Yet he couldn't walk away. The affair continued for months, a high-wire act performed without a net. But the wire snapped the night Helen told him she was pregnant. The air in the apartment, usually thick with the smell of Bumpy's expensive cigars and the sound of jazz records, suddenly felt vacuum-sealed. Bumpy Johnson, the man who had stared down hitmen and federal agents without blinking, felt a cold knot of genuine terror tighten in his chest. A mistress was a problem. A child was a catastrophe. In the racial and social climate of the mid-1950s, a mixed-race child born to these 2 specific parents was a living, breathing target. Bumpy knew instantly that this child could never be known. If the world discovered he had a son with a white woman, it wouldn't just be a personal failure, it would be a political disaster. The black community, which looked to him as a pillar of strength against white oppression, would view it as the ultimate hypocrisy. The white authorities would view it as a provocation, and the mob? The mob would view the child as a bargaining chip. Bumpy could see the future clearly. A son used as a hostage, a son used to force him to sign over the numbers racket, a son used to break him. He sat in the dark of that apartment, looking at the city lights through the window, and made the hardest decision of his life. He would not abandon the child. That went against every code of honor he possessed. But he could not acknowledge him. He had to erase the boy before he was even born. He had to build a ghost life, a parallel reality where his son could exist safely, but totally apart from the legend of Bumpy Johnson. The operation to hide the pregnancy was more complex than any bank robbery or drug shipment Bumpy had ever coordinated. He bypassed his usual crew. He couldn't trust his lieutenants with this. The secret was too explosive. Instead, he reached out to a network of Jewish lawyers and accountants in Midtown Manhattan, men who operated in the gray areas of the law and who had no connection to the Harlem streets. Through a web of shell companies and blind trusts, Bumpy purchased a secluded estate in a wealthy, quiet corner of Connecticut. It was a large colonial house set back from the road, surrounded by high stone walls and dense woods, a fortress disguised as a family home. He created a new identity for Helen, setting her up as a wealthy widow of a merchant marine, a story that explained her solitude and her money without inviting questions. When the time came for the birth, Bumpy arranged for a private doctor, a man who had lost his license years ago for gambling debts and was desperate enough to do exactly what he was told. The birth took place in the master bedroom of the Connecticut house, far away from the hospitals where birth certificates were public record. Bumpy was there, standing in the corner of the room, watching the arrival of the only son he would ever have. When the boy cried for the first time, Bumpy felt a surge of pride that was immediately strangled by the necessity of silence. He named the boy David. It was a strong name, a biblical name, and privately it was a tribute to his own brother. But on paper, David did not exist. There was no birth certificate filed in New York or Connecticut. There was no father listed. Legally, the boy was a ghost. For the next 5 years, Bumpy Johnson lived a life of staggering duality. To the world, he was the king of Harlem, fighting off the encroachments of the police and managing the volatile politics of the underworld. He went home to Mame every night, played the role of the devoted husband, and maintained the facade of the perfect marriage. But once a week, usually on Tuesdays, Bumpy would vanish. He would slip out of the back of a barber shop on 135th Street, get into a nondescript sedan driven by a man who wasn't part of the life, and drive north. As the car crossed the city limits and the concrete of Harlem gave way to the green trees of the suburbs, Bumpy would physically transform. The tension would leave his shoulders. The scowl that kept his enemies at bay would soften. For a few hours in that house in Connecticut, he wasn't the godfather. He was a father. He would sit on the floor and play with David. He would read him stories, bringing the same passion to children's books that he brought to his own reading. He watched David grow, noting with a mix of pride and fear how much the boy looked like him. David had Bumpy's eyes, dark, observant, and intense. He had Bumpy's stillness, but this double life came with a crushing psychological cost. Every time Bumpy left Connecticut to return to Harlem, he felt like he was abandoning a piece of his soul. And every time he walked through the door of his apartment to face Mame, he felt the sharp sting of betrayal. Mame was not a fool. She was a woman of immense intuition. She knew the rhythms of Bumpy's life better than he knew them himself. She began to sense the gaps in his schedule, the moments where he was unreachable. She saw the receipts that didn't add up, the mileage on the cars that didn't match the trips to the local clubs. She smelled the faint, unfamiliar scent of the countryside on his clothes, the smell of wood smoke and grass that didn't exist in the concrete jungle of Harlem. But Mame, in her wisdom and her pride, chose not to speak. She assumed it was a mistress, a temporary dalliance that would fade. She never imagined that Bumpy was building an entire second family, a dynasty in the shadows. The situation became critical in the early 1960s. The law finally caught up with Bumpy Johnson. He was indicted on federal drug charges, charges that many believed were trumped up, a conspiracy to remove a powerful black figure from the board. Bumpy fought the case with everything he had, but the verdict came down hard. He was sentenced to a long stretch in Alcatraz, the inescapable fortress in the San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz was the end of the world for a man like Bumpy. It meant total isolation from his power base, his wife, and his secret life. Before he surrendered to the marshals, Bumpy made a desperate trip to Connecticut. He sat with Helen, who was now terrified. She was a single mother raising a black child in a white suburb, living on money that was now in jeopardy. Without Bumpy's physical presence, she felt exposed. Bumpy promised her that the money would keep coming, that the lawyers had been instructed to maintain the trust, no matter what happened to him. He held David, who was now old enough to ask questions, and told him that his father had to go away on business for a long time. He couldn't tell the boy he was going to prison. He couldn't taint the boy's innocence with the reality of who his father truly was. But the real danger began after Bumpy was locked away. The isolation of Alcatraz was absolute. Bumpy was thousands of miles away from everything he loved. Helen, alone in the big house in Connecticut, began to unravel. The silence was deafening. She needed connection. She needed to know that Bumpy was still there, that he hadn't forgotten them. She began to write to him. She wrote long, detailed letters, pouring her heart out onto the page. She described David's life in minute detail: his first day of school, the way he stood up to a bully, his aptitude for math. She included photographs, black and white snapshots of a boy who was growing into a young man, a boy who bore the undeniable stamp of the Johnson bloodline. These letters were dangerous contraband. If prison guards found them, they could be used to blackmail Bumpy. If they were intercepted by federal agents, they could be used to expose his hidden assets. But Bumpy, starving for connection in the cold gray of his cell, couldn't bring himself to destroy them. He knew the rules. He knew that a man in his position should never keep a paper trail. But looking at the photos of David was the only thing that kept him human in a place designed to break men. So he took a risk that was uncharacteristic of the master strategist. He hid the letters. He had a false bottom constructed in his personal trunk, the footlocker that contained his legal papers and books. He slid the letters and the photographs underneath the lining, believing they were safe. He believed that he was the only one who would ever open that trunk. Years passed. The world outside changed. The civil rights movement exploded. The streets of Harlem grew harder, more violent. The old codes of honor were being replaced by the chaotic violence of the heroin trade. When Bumpy was finally released in 1963, he returned to a New York that felt different. He was older, tired, and carrying the weight of a decade of incarceration. He returned to the open arms of Harlem, greeted like a returning king. There was a parade, literally and metaphorically. Mame was there, standing tall, the dutiful wife who had waited for her husband. She welcomed him back into their home, ready to resume their life as the royal couple of Lenox Avenue. But Bumpy brought his baggage with him, both emotional and physical. The trunk from Alcatraz was carried into the master bedroom and placed in the corner. Bumpy intended to empty it, to burn the letters, to finally close the loop on the risk he had taken. But the chaos of his return was overwhelming. There were sit-downs to arrange, captains to bring in line, and a new generation of Italian mobsters to deal with. Bumpy was immediately thrown into a war for his territory. He was distracted, and in his distraction, he made the fatal mistake of leaving the trunk unlocked. It was a Tuesday morning, raining hard against the windows of the brownstone. Bumpy was out at the Flash Inn, meeting with his lieutenants. Mame was home alone. She decided it was time to clean out the remnants of prison, to wash away the scent of Alcatraz from their lives. She opened the trunk. She began removing the books, the legal pads, the old uniforms. Her hand brushed against the bottom of the locker, and she felt something loose. The lining wasn't secure. Mame Johnson, with the curiosity that had served her so well as the wife of a crime boss, pulled at the loose fabric. It gave way. Beneath the false bottom lay a stack of envelopes, tied together with a piece of twine. They were not legal documents. They were letters. The handwriting was feminine, elegant, and unfamiliar. Mame's heart hammered against her ribs, a slow, heavy rhythm of dread. She sat on the edge of the bed, the rain drumming a relentless beat against the glass, and untied the twine. She pulled out the first photograph. It was a picture of a boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing in front of a large stone house. He was smiling, a gap-toothed grin that Mame knew. She knew it because she had seen it in the wedding photos of her own husband. She looked at the eyes. They were Bumpy's eyes. She turned the photo over. On the back, in that elegant script, was written, "David, 1961. He asks for you every day." Mame felt the air leave the room. This wasn't just infidelity. This was a parallel life. She opened the letters. She read the words of a woman who loved her husband, a woman who shared a history with him that Mame had been completely excluded from. She read about the house in Connecticut, the trust fund, the private doctors. She realized that while she had been visiting Bumpy in prison, bringing him news of the streets and holding down his empire, he had been mentally living in another world, with another family. The betrayal was total. But as Mame read on, the betrayal turned into something colder. Realization. She realized the danger. She read a letter where Helen expressed concern about a car she had seen parked down the road from their estate, a car she didn't recognize. Helen wrote that she felt watched. Mame froze. She knew the streets. She knew that Bumpy had enemies who would stop at nothing to hurt him. If Helen had spotted a car, it meant the secret was already leaking. It meant that someone else, someone dangerous, might be sniffing around the Connecticut house. Mame didn't scream. She didn't cry. She placed the photo back in the stack and looked at the trunk. She realized that her husband, the great strategist, had left his flank wide open. He had built a secret world, but he had failed to protect it. And now that secret world was about to collide with the violence of Harlem. Mame stood up, smoothing the fabric of her dress. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't wait for Bumpy to come home and explain. There was no time for explanations. She had to become the thing Bumpy had always tried to protect her from, a player in the game. She had to find out who else knew. She had to find out if the Italians were already moving. And, most of all, she had to decide what to do with the boy. The secret son was no longer just a ghost. He was a piece on the board, and the game had just entered its most dangerous phase. The rain that battered the windows of the Lenox Terrace apartment did not let up for 3 days. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy enough to crush bone. Mame Johnson, having discovered the existence of Bumpy's secret son and the life he had built in the shadows, did not explode. She did not throw the letters in his face the moment he walked through the door, smelling of cigar smoke and the damp wool of his coat. Instead, she did something far more terrifying. She waited. She returned the letters to the false bottom of the trunk, retied the twine with the exact same knot, and smoothed the lining back into place so perfectly that not even Bumpy, with his predator's eye for detail, would notice it had been touched. She needed time. She needed to understand the blast radius of this bomb before she detonated it. For the next 48 hours, Mame watched her husband with a new clinical detachment. She watched him eat his breakfast. She watched him read the newspaper. And she watched him dress for the street. She looked for the cracks she had missed before. She saw the way his eyes lingered on the phone when it rang, the way he hesitated before answering, as if expecting news from a world she wasn't supposed to know existed. She realized that the exhaustion etched into his face wasn't just from the stress of retaking Harlem from the Italians. It was the exhaustion of a man living two lives, carrying the weight of two families. But Mame wasn't just a scorned wife. She was a partner in a criminal empire. Her heartbreak was real, a cold stone in her chest. But her survival instinct was stronger. She knew that if she knew about the boy, it was only a matter of time before Bumpy's enemies knew. And, unlike her, they wouldn't use the information to save the family. They would use it to bury them. While Bumpy was out securing his alliances, Mame made a move that defied the unspoken rules of their marriage. She operated behind his back. She didn't use Bumpy's men. She couldn't trust them. Loyalty in the underworld was often a matter of who signed the checks, and she didn't know if Bumpy had soldiers who were also living double lives, sworn to protect the secret in Connecticut. Instead, she reached out to an old contact, a private investigator named Silas, who operated out of a small office in Bed-Stuy. Silas was a man who owed Mame a life debt. She had paid for his surgery years ago, when the streets had chewed him up and spit him out. She met him in a diner far from Harlem, sliding a piece of paper across the table with the address she had memorized from Helen's letters. "I don't want you to talk to anyone," she told him, her voice low and steady. "I just want you to watch. Tell me who comes, who goes, and tell me if anyone else is watching." Silas called her 2 days later. The news he brought confirmed Mame's worst fears. "The house is quiet, Mrs. Johnson," he said. "Woman and a boy. Nice place. But there's a car parked a quarter-mile down the road. Blue Chevy. 2 men inside. They've been there for 6 hours, just watching the driveway. They aren't cops, and they aren't ours." The blood ran cold in Mame's veins. The Italians. The Genovese family had found the weak link. They were watching the house, waiting for the right moment to snatch the boy and use him as the ultimate leverage against Bumpy. The secret was out. The game had changed from a domestic betrayal to a tactical emergency. Mame hung up the phone and sat in the silence of her living room. She realized she had run out of time. She couldn't wait for Bumpy to slip up. She had to break the seal. When Bumpy came home that evening, the apartment was dark. He flicked on the lamp in the hallway, startled to find Mame sitting in the armchair, still wearing her coat. The look on her face wasn't anger. It was a profound, tragic resolve. Bumpy stopped, his hand still on the doorknob. He sensed the shift in the air immediately. The predator in him woke up. "Mame?" he asked, his voice rough. "What's wrong?" Mame didn't answer immediately. She reached into her purse and pulled out the photograph she had taken from the trunk. The picture of David standing in front of the Connecticut house. She placed it on the small table between them. The silence that followed was loud enough to deafen them both. Bumpy looked at the photo, and for the first time in 20 years, Mame saw her husband flinch. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking old and exposed. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't make an excuse. He simply slumped, the weight of the secret finally crushing him. "How long?" Mame asked. Her voice didn't tremble. 10 years, Bumpy whispered. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for a forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. "Mame, I don't want to hear about her," Mame cut him off, her tone like a razor. "And I don't want to hear about how you thought you were protecting me. You weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself. But that's not why we're having this conversation tonight." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "Silas went up there today. There's a blue Chevy parked down the road from the house. 2 men. They aren't feds, Bumpy. They're watching the boy." The transformation in Bumpy Johnson was instantaneous. The shame vanished, replaced by a cold, lethal fury. His eyes hardened into black stones. "Italians?" "Genovese," Mame said. "They found him, Bumpy. They know, and they're waiting. Probably for the weekend, when the house is quiet." Bumpy paced the room, his mind racing through the tactical map. He realized the magnitude of his error. He had built a fortress for his secret, but he had built it on sand. "I have to get them out," he said, his voice dropping to a growl. "Tonight." "You can't go," Mame said. "If you leave Harlem tonight, everyone will know something is wrong. The streets are watching you too closely. If you run north, the Italians will know the gig is up, and they'll hit the house before you get past the Bronx." Bumpy stopped pacing. He looked at his wife, really looked at her, and realized that in his arrogance, he had underestimated the woman who shared his bed. She wasn't just a bystander. She was a general. "Then what do we do?" he asked. "I go," Mame said. Bumpy started to protest, but she silenced him with a raised hand. "I go. A woman traveling alone is invisible. I'll go up there, I'll get the woman and the boy, and I'll bring them to the safe house in Jersey. You stay here. You make noise. You go to the Flash Inn, you buy drinks, you let everyone see Bumpy Johnson holding court. You keep the Italians looking at you while I move the pieces off the board." It was a plan born of desperation and genius. Bumpy looked at his wife with a mixture of awe and guilt. He nodded slowly. "Take Red," he said, referring to his most trusted driver. "He'll keep you safe." "No," Mame said. "I drive myself. No soldiers, no guns. Just me." The drive to Connecticut was a blur of rain and headlights. Mame's grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled. She was driving toward the woman who had stolen a decade of her husband's heart, toward the child who carried his blood. Every instinct in her body screamed to turn around, to let the world burn, to let Bumpy pay the price for his betrayal. But Mame Johnson was built different. She honored the code, even when the code had been broken against her. She knew that the boy was innocent. He was a child caught in the crossfire of giant, violent men, and she would not let a child die to satisfy a grudge. She arrived at the estate just after midnight. The house was dark, sleeping in the midst of the wet woods. As she turned into the long driveway, she checked the rearview mirror. The road behind her was empty. She had slipped past the surveillance, or perhaps the rain had driven the watchers away for the night. She parked the car and walked to the front door, the gravel crunching softly under her heels. She didn't knock. She used the key she had found taped inside the cover of Helen's last letter in the trunk. The door swung open. The house smelled of lavender and old books, a scent so different from the smoke and whiskey of Harlem that it made Mame pause. She walked into the living room and turned on a single lamp. "Helen!" she called out. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the authority of a command. There was a sound of movement upstairs, footsteps running. A moment later, Helen appeared at the top of the stairs wearing a silk robe, a revolver held shakily in her hand. When she saw Mame standing in her living room, the gun lowered. Helen's face went pale. She knew who this was. She had seen pictures in the papers. This was the Queen. "Put the gun away," Mame said, her voice flat. "If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't have come myself." Helen came down the stairs, trembling. "Where is he? Where's Bumpy?" "He's in Harlem, saving your life," Mame said. She looked at the woman, beautiful, terrified, soft. She could see why Bumpy had been drawn to her. She was everything the streets were not. "Pack a bag, just the essentials. You and the boy. You have 5 minutes." "Why?" Helen asked, her voice rising in panic. "What's happening?" "The Italians found you," Mame said brutally. "There are men down the road waiting to snatch your son. They want to use him to break Bumpy. Now, do you want to argue with me, or do you want your son to live?" The mention of the boy snapped Helen out of her shock. She dropped the gun on the sofa and ran back upstairs. Mame stood in the center of the room, looking at the life her husband had built. She saw the toys scattered on the rug, the books on the shelves with Bumpy's handwriting in the margins. It was a home. It was a real home, perhaps more real than the fortress she and Bumpy inhabited. The pain hit her then, a sharp physical blow to the gut. But she pushed it down. 5 minutes later, Helen returned, dragging a suitcase and holding the hand of a sleepy, confused boy. David. Mame looked at him. He was tall for his age, with the same broad shoulders and heavy-lidded eyes as Bumpy. He looked at Mame with curiosity, not fear. "Are you a friend of my father's?" the boy asked. Mame's heart broke. She looked at the boy, the living evidence of her husband's infidelity, and she forced a smile. "Yes, baby, I'm an old friend. We're going on a trip." They loaded into the car. Mame put Helen and David in the back seat, covering them with a blanket. "Stay down," she ordered. "Do not sit up until I tell you." As she reversed out of the driveway, the headlights swept across the trees. And then, chaos erupted. The blue Chevy was blocking the end of the driveway. The headlights blinded Mame as she accelerated. The Italians hadn't been sleeping. They had been waiting for movement. 2 men stepped out of the Chevy, holding shotguns. "Get down!" Mame screamed. She slammed her foot on the gas. The car was a heavy Buick, built like a tank. Mame didn't try to stop. She aimed the grill of the Buick directly at the gap between the Chevy and the stone pillar of the gate. The men raised their weapons. A boom echoed through the woods, shattering the windshield on the passenger side. Glass sprayed over Mame, cutting her cheek. She didn't flinch. She kept the pedal floored. The Buick clipped the fender of the Chevy with a sickening crunch of metal, spinning the smaller car into the ditch. Mame fought the wheel, the tires spinning in the mud, until they found traction on the asphalt of the road. She roared away into the darkness, the engine whining in protest. Behind them, she saw the headlights of the Chevy swing back onto the road. They were giving chase. "Hold on," Mame said, her voice calm amidst the adrenaline. She knew these roads from the map she had studied. She knew there was a bridge 3 miles ahead, a narrow crossing over a ravine. If she could get across, she could lose them in the winding roads leading to the highway. But the Chevy was faster. It was gaining on them, the headlights growing larger in the mirror. Another shot rang out, punching a hole through the trunk. Helen screamed. Mame gripped the wheel. She was a woman of Harlem. She had driven through riots and police barricades. She wasn't going to lose a race to 2 hired thugs in the woods. She saw the bridge approaching. She swerved hard to the left, feinting a turn, then swung back to the right, cutting the corner dangerously close to the guardrail. The Buick skidded, the rear end swinging out over the precipice, but Mame caught the slide. The Chevy behind them wasn't so lucky. The driver, reacting to Mame's feint, overcorrected on the slick, wet leaves. Mame watched in the mirror as the headlights spun wildly, illuminating the trees, before crashing through the wooden rail and disappearing into the ravine below. There was a distant crash, then silence. Mame didn't slow down. She drove for another hour, her hands shaking only after the danger had passed. She crossed the state line into New Jersey as the sun began to rise, a gray, watery light filtering through the shattered windshield. They arrived at the safe house, a small brownstone in Newark, owned by a cousin of Bumpy's, just as the city was waking up. Mame parked the battered car in the alley. She turned to the back seat. Helen was weeping silently, holding David tight against her chest. David was wide awake, his eyes wide with the trauma of the night. Mame opened the door. "You're safe," she said. Later that afternoon, Bumpy arrived. He had driven from Harlem like a madman after Mame called him from a payphone. When he walked into the safe house and saw Mame sitting at the kitchen table, a bandage on her cheek and glass dust still in her hair, he fell to his knees. The great Bumpy Johnson, the king, wept at his wife's feet. He held her hands, kissing the knuckles, whispering apologies that couldn't cover the magnitude of what she had done. But Mame pulled her hands away gently. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray street. "It's over, Bumpy," she said. "I know," he said, standing up. "I'll make it right. I'll send them away. No," Mame turned to face him. "You won't send them away. I already did." Bumpy looked confused. "What?" "I made the call," Mame said. "I called the contact in Switzerland, the school, the one you wrote about in the letters but never had the courage to book. The plane leaves tonight from Idlewild. Helen and the boy go. They don't come back, ever." Bumpy looked at the closed door of the bedroom where his son was sleeping. "I need to see him. I need to explain." "You explain nothing," Mame said, her voice hard as iron. "You gave up the right to explain when you put him in the crosshairs of a shotgun. If you go in there, if you try to be his father now, you put a target on his back for the rest of his life. The only way he survives is if he stops being Bumpy Johnson's son. He has to become a ghost, Bumpy. For real this time." Bumpy stared at her. He knew she was right. He knew that his world was poison to the boy. He walked to the bedroom door and placed his hand on the wood. He stood there for a long time, listening to the soft breathing on the other side. He wanted to burst in, to hold the boy, to tell him that he loved him. But he was a man who understood sacrifice. He knew that the greatest act of love he could perform was to disappear. He dropped his hand. He turned back to Mame, his eyes hollow. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." That night, a black sedan took Helen and David to the airport. Bumpy didn't go. He stood at the window of the safe house, watching the taillights fade into the darkness. He watched until they were gone, until the street was empty. Then he went to the fireplace in the living room. Mame had already placed the stack of letters and photographs on the grate. She handed him a match. Bumpy looked at the letters, the record of the only time in his life he had felt truly free. He struck the match and dropped it. The paper curled and blackened, the flames licking at the words of love and the pictures of the boy. They watched in silence as the secret burned, turning into gray ash that crumbled under the heat. They drove back to Harlem in silence. When they crossed the bridge into Manhattan, Bumpy reached across the seat and took Mame's hand. She didn't pull away, but she didn't squeeze back. The bond remained, but the intimacy was scarred forever. In the years that followed, Bumpy Johnson ruled Harlem with a renewed ferocity. He became harder, colder. The men on the street whispered that something had changed in the old man, that he had lost a piece of his humanity. They didn't know that he was grieving a living death, mourning a son who was growing up in the Swiss Alps, learning to ski and speak French, oblivious to the fact that his tuition was paid for by the blood of the Harlem numbers racket. Mame kept the secret. She kept it through Bumpy's heart attacks, through the riots of the late 60s, and through the slow decline of the empire. She became the fierce guardian of his legend, ensuring that the world remembered Bumpy Johnson as a hero, a warrior, and a man of the people. She wrote books. She gave interviews. She smiled for the cameras. But every now and then, late at night, she would look at Bumpy when he thought he was alone, staring at a blank wall. And she knew he was seeing the face of the boy in the window. When Bumpy died in 1968, collapsing at the Wells restaurant, the newspapers reported that he died of heart failure. But Mame knew the truth. His heart had failed 10 years earlier, on the night he watched a black sedan carry his son away into the darkness, the night his wife saved his life by destroying his heart. The secret son remained a ghost, a footnote erased from history, living a life of peace that his father had paid for with his soul. And Mame Johnson, the Queen of Harlem, took the truth to her grave, the final act of loyalty from a wife who loved the sinner but hated the sin. Thanks for listening, folks. If you liked that video and want more, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any Bumpy Johnson stories.